Welcome back to the Fat Loss Academy podcast, episode 5. I'm your host, Josh Trinchini, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about how long you should be in a deficit for, or essentially how long your deficit should last based on your goals. So we've already covered a couple of things in the last few episodes now. We've looked at what a calorie deficit is, how we actually burn energy, how we create a calorie deficit for ourselves, and we've also talked about how long it can take to lose weight. And then in our last episode, we talked about the importance of setting realistic expectations. And I think today's episode will tie in nicely with last episode because it's also going to help set a bit of a foundation, about the expectations that you can set on your weight loss journey. So a lot of people, or a really common mistake that I see a lot of people make when they try to lose weight, is that they just try and diet for as long as possible, thinking that they just need to keep on going until they reach their end goal. Now, obviously, we all have different goals. Some people maybe just want to lose a few kilos, and maybe some people want to lose a large amount of weight, maybe 20, 30 kilos plus. So they think that in order to do that, they just need to keep dieting until they reach that end goal. And you can do this. It is definitely one option. It's just definitely one that I don't necessarily recommend, and I'm going to touch on that in today's episode. So in my experience, both personally and for the people that I've coached, the people who've had the most success with their weight loss break their fat loss journey up into specific phases rather than just trying to diet for as long as possible. And this is something which is known as nutritional periodization. Essentially, what this means is just the process of planning out your diet on a macro level. Okay, so ensure that you have phases dedicated to each outcome, which are needed to facilitate long-term success. So periodization is terminology which is often used in the training world. To use a basic example, think about something like football or soccer. They use periodization to break up the season. Okay, so you might have your entire year, okay? And then you'll break that up into specific phases throughout the year. And that could be the preseason, then you've got your in-season, and then you've got your post-season as well, okay? So you've got your macro cycle, which might be the entire soccer season. And then you have your mesocycles, which are your preseason, your in-season, and then your post-season. And then you've got what we call our microcycles, which are think of that as the week-to-week training you're doing in those specific phases, because what you're doing during your preseason, your training during preseason is going to look a lot different to what you're doing in the season, and then it's going to look a lot different post-season as well. Now, I like to do the exact same thing for a fat loss goal as well. Break it up into specific phases, and I'm going to talk about why we do that in today's episode. So in other words, to just re-clarify what nutritional periodization is, it's essentially a specific period of time where we are in a fat loss phase, followed by a period of time where we aren't in a fat loss phase, okay? And for numerous reasons we do this. It really helps with motivation because the longer you go into a diet and the longer you're in your calorie deficit, the harder it is. It helps with consistency, so you're obviously able to stick to it when you have a determined period of time and phase, rather than, if I just tell you, okay, we're just going to diet until you lose 30 kilos, chances are you're not going to be consistent for the same amount of time. And same with discipline as well. You're probably going to lose a lot of discipline. And when we do break it up into specific phases, it just helps you stick to the plan. But it actually helps put more of a plan in place as well. Okay, it's really hard to plan for an unknown period of time. So when we do put some sort of parameters around it, it really helps make sticking to the plan a lot easier. So the first question a lot of people have is, why not just diet for as long as possible? Okay, and I'm going to show you in a minute why it actually becomes harder, but I tried to come up with a bit of a good analogy to help sort of get this point across, and I thought of it like this. Think of it a little bit like an exam, okay, that you have to complete in university. If you know the date of the exam, you can likely study up until that date, and then you're going to complete it, and then you'll be able to move on to the next thing. But what if you were given the exam with no date or no time frame? It was just sometime in the future that you had to get done. Chances are you'd probably just keep putting it off and you'd never get around to actually completing it, okay? Now, the other reason that we don't want to be in a calorie deficit for as long as possible is because the longer you're in a deficit, the harder it becomes. Plus, weight loss will slow down the longer you are into your journey. And this is something that we call metabolic adaptation. Essentially, the longer you stay in a deficit, over time, your body is going to start burning less energy, okay? Now, this can lead to a lot of plateaus, and it can make it a lot harder to lose or maintain a healthy weight long term, okay? So metabolic adaptation essentially means in order to keep losing weight, we need to keep reducing our calorie intake. Now, this is why you might have tried losing weight in the past, and even if you thought you were still in a deficit, you started to hit a bit of a plateau. So essentially, metabolic adaptation can happen at different rates, and it happens very different different ways to different people. Some people might experience it rather quickly. Some people it might not really occur to. And we've sort of briefly touched on this in previous episodes about, needing to make adjustments to your calorie goals over time. But essentially, the whole crux of it is the longer you're in a deficit, eventually the amount of calories you're burning in a day are going to lower because your body adapts. Your body gets this sensation that, okay, I'm only eating 1,500 calories now. I'm going to try and learn to survive on 1,500 calories. And then over time, your body gets really effective at using 1,500 calories. Whereas before, 1,500 calories might have been like a really large deficit for someone. And now over time, through these adaptations, it's not that big of a deficit anymore, which means the only way to keep making progress and keep moving forwards is to lower your calorie intake or increase how many calories you're burning. And obviously, the more and more we do those two things, the harder it gets over time. All right, so that is sort of metabolic adaptation in a nutshell. Now let's talk about weight loss duration, okay? So I've talked about the fact that I don't think people should just keep going for as long as possible. What I seem to find to be most effective with the least downsides is when you run a fat loss phase, which is anywhere sort of from between 6 to 12 weeks, or usually I'll recommend, depending on the goal, but most people 8 to 12 weeks, okay? Now, there are very few negative side effects of running a shorter fat loss diet, aside from the fact that you might not lose much fat, but it is difficult to differentiate, fat loss from water weight changes and so on. So you do need at least a few weeks of data. So that's why I sort of say that 6 weeks sort of minimum. Now, if you have a very small goal, then you may only need 6 weeks, okay? But there is no negative effects to doing a minimum amount of time. It's just obviously less changes can occur because you don't have as much time for those changes to occur, okay? But I do like that sort of 8 to 12 week period. Now, on the upper end of that scale though, sometimes maybe between 12 and 16 weeks, okay? But as soon as you get to that sort of upper end, let's use 16 weeks as an example, I'll definitely tend to notice a massive decline in adherence, and then the chance of a rebound weight gain, that starts to steeply increase. So, as people start to get in a deficit, which is longer than 12, 13, 14 weeks, then that decline in adherence and that rebound in weight gain starts to steeply increase, okay? Most people by the 16-week sort of stage are at a chronic dieting risk, okay? So, you've been in a deficit for a long period of time, motivation tends to get a lot lower, discipline tends to start to drop off, you start to lose a little bit of consistency, and even just your overall fatigue of just dieting and being, strict for a certain period of time does really, really start to take a toll, okay? So I like to tell people that it's much better to try and lose 5 kilos during a successful 12-week fat loss phase than it is to try and shoot for 10 kilos across 16 weeks, only to burn out, regain 5 kilos, and have worked longer and harder for what will feel like a disappointing failure. So again, even though I sort of say, 16 weeks is that upper limit, I sort of try and most of the time recommend people stay within that sort of 8 to 12 week window, okay? So if I was to set fairly extreme upper and lower bounds, I think fat loss phases should be run for no less than sort of 4 weeks and no more than 6 weeks at a time. So again, like I said, 8 to 12 weeks sort of tends to be that more conservative ideal. So that's time. But what about weight loss rates? How much should we sort of be trying to lose in that period of time? So in one of the previous episodes, I talked a lot about how quickly you can lose weight And I use some calculations to provide some examples, but this is more about setting some limits around that. So this can just be used as a really general rule of thumb because, most people probably aren't going to do calculations or anything like that. But I usually recommend that most people aim to lose roughly between 0.5% and 1% of their body weight per week. Now, this is likely best in most circumstances. So there is obviously a temptation on fat loss diet to often lose as much as possible, as quickly as possible, but this can be detrimental to sustained losses. It can also be detrimental to muscle retention and just long-term fitness and overall health as well. Okay, so these recommendations of sort of 0.5% to 1% of body weight per week sort of fall in this increased likelihood of sustained success and maintained overall health during this journey. Okay, and what about overall limits? So let's say, we know that we're maybe going to try and stick to an 8 to 12 week window. What are the sort of limits that we should be putting, or should we be putting limits on this? Now, again, I sort of recommend that most people try not to aim to lose more than 10% of their total body weight across a single deficit or dieting phase. Okay, so if you're going to go into a fat loss phase, which is around 8 to 12 weeks, I don't think it's a good idea to be losing more than 10% of your total body weight in that period of time. And I'm going to give some reasons for this in a minute, but I do also want to touch on the fact that it's definitely not necessary to lose that much weight either. Okay, so I'm just sort of putting that on the, again, sort of providing a bit of an upper limit. Okay, but obviously, the negative side effects of being in a deficit and dieting for a period of time can be overwhelming for some people. And, by the time you've lost maybe 4 or 5% of your total body weight, you might be ready to take a bit of a break from that as well. Okay, so again, emphasizing the point that a slower pace and maybe a shorter diet can greatly increase the chances of sustained weight loss for many people. And there will be outliers to this, of course, but if we're just talking about the overall sort of general population, this tends to sort of be best for most people. Now, for those looking to lose a larger amount of weight, potentially doing it across multiple fat loss phases, then, maybe it's good to sort of set a bit of a target. Okay, maybe trying to lose like anywhere between that 4 to 10% of total body weight during those phases. Okay. And the reason for this is sort of psychological as well, because if you're losing smaller than this, it's not very noticeable and it can tend to be demotivating as well. But obviously, if we are pushing over that 10% mark, then again, it's just going to probably limit your ability to A, do another successful fat loss phase in the future, but B, also just maintain and sustain the progress that you've made. Okay. So yes, that sort of recommended weight loss rate sort of between 0.5 to 1% per week, but then not aiming to lose more than 10% of total body weight during a single fat loss phase. Now, why do I put these limitations in place? Like, why wouldn't we just aim to lose more or as much as humanly possible in the given time phrase? So the more weight we lose and the quicker we lose weight, there are increased risks. Now, these risks can include losing muscle mass. There will be a decrease in your performance. There will be a decrease in your overall health. We have to remember that being in a deficit and eating less and losing body fat isn't necessarily the most optimal state for overall health. As I said, your metabolism will slow down and your NEAT, so how much energy you're just burning on a daily basis from your daily activities, will lower over time due to that metabolic adaptation. So if you're losing more and you're losing it at a quicker rate, this will occur quicker. You're also going to notice a decrease in your sleep. Okay, so you're going to notice poorer sleep, which can impact weight loss and actually make weight loss harder. So there's a lot of research out there, and I'm going to talk about this in a future episode, but poor sleep will result in poor progress when it comes to weight loss. You're also going to have an increase in stress hormones, and again, can also increase the difficulty to lose weight. There's going to be an increase in hunger, which again, we know that's going to make weight loss harder. There's going to be an increase in overall fatigue, and there's also going to be the accumulated psychological issues as well. So if you're losing more weight and you're doing it at a quicker pace, chances are that is going to mean that you are probably being a little bit more strict. So there's this increase in discipline and willpower and all of this sort of stuff. And that's really going to result in some accumulated psychological issues. So, obviously during a fat loss phase, there are going to be times where, you do have to say no to certain social events and you have to avoid certain foods and this sort of things. And these things do add up and do take a toll on us during a fat loss phase. But the biggest one though, the overall sort of reason for these sort of limits that I put in place, like I've said multiple times now, is sustainability. We have to remember to think long term. You might be thinking, okay, what if I haven't reached my goal? Again, it's important that we are thinking long term. And if we think long term, it would be much better breaking your goal up into multiple phases rather than just trying to do it all in one hit. So as an example, if your goal is to lose 10 kilo, that might look like 2 12-week fat loss phases with a bit of a break in between them. Yes, it might take longer, but again, ask yourself this, and this is something I love saying to all of my clients that I work with. Would you rather lose the weight and keep it off, or would you like to gain it all back again in the space of 12 months? Because this is something that I see happen all the time. I see people who, maybe there's like a gym or like a nutrition company or whatever it is running a 6-week or 8-week intense fat loss challenge. See heaps of people sign up to those things. And, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with them, but it's the people that go too hard, too quick, who often make some really, really amazing progress. But then in the space of 12 months, I look and they've gained it all back, or potentially they're in a worse off situation. Now, I don't have the exact stats in front of me. I'm just doing this as from memory, but I'm pretty sure that most people who lose weight, I think, again, I don't have the exact numbers. I think it's 10 kilos plus. I think it's 80 to 90% of them gain that weight back plus more within the first year. Okay. And I'm assuming most people want to avoid that. And that is why I'm giving today's episode. And this is why I'm sort of talking about what I'm talking about, because in my experience, someone who's been doing this for 7+ years now, it's these principles which I've discussed in this episode which have led to that longer term success. It's the reason why I've had clients who have lost a bunch of weight and 12 to 2 years later have kept it off. This is the stuff that I had to start applying to have my own success with weight loss as well. There's times in the past where I had lost body fat and then I'd just gain it back again, and then I had to diet again, and then I gained it back again, and it just seemed like this treacherous cycle. And I wanted to know, like, am I just going to be stuck in this cycle forever, or is there a way to get out of this cycle? And it wasn't until I started to learn about these things and started to apply them on my own journey where I started to make that long-term progress. So again, this is why we apply nutritional periodization and why I see a lot more people make success running multiple fat loss phases. Now, setting the right goals. Knowing all of this, you're probably more ready to create a plan of attack. And like I talked about in last episode, setting the realistic expectations. You can use this knowledge now to help set some of those realistic expectations. So my recommendations are that a fat loss phase should be run for around 8 to 12 weeks, okay? Aiming to lose anywhere between 0.5 to 1% of body weight per week. If it is slightly lower than that, not a big issue. Yes, some weeks it might be a little bit higher too, maybe even in the beginning, usually, because you're going to lose a lot more body weight and things like that as well. But when we look at the average and the average across that sort of 8 to 12 week period, it'll usually fall nicely between that 0.5 to 1%. And then again, not aiming to lose more than 10% of your body weight in the entire fat loss phase. Okay, so a few key takeaways. You're better breaking it up into phases rather than just constantly being in a calorie deficit until you reach your goal. It's also better to have defined phases, as this helps with consistency and adherence, and we know how important that is on a fat loss journey. And weight loss gets harder the longer we do it. So it can actually be really beneficial and actually quicker in the long run when you zoom out and you look at the whole picture, to take defined breaks from actually trying to lose fat the whole time. Now, I do want to finish with just a few important considerations as well. If I'm talking about an 8 to 12 week window, you do have to ask yourself, okay, have you been consistent for 12 weeks? If the answer is no, you if the answer is yes, you may need to take a break. Okay, you've done your 8 to 12 weeks and it might be time to take a break. But if the answer is no, then you might find that it is okay to go a little bit longer. So if I do, write up a bit of a plan of attack and I say I'm going to go into a fat loss phase for 12 weeks, but if over the course of that 12 weeks, like 1 week I was a little bit, I went away for a week and I didn't really pay attention to things too much, or another week I wasn't super consistent, then I probably haven't actually been in a fat loss phase for 12 weeks. So I can probably extend it a little bit. But it's always good to check in with yourself and see how you're going, because if you do notice like there is a lot of increase in hunger, there is that diet fatigue, and you do notice that maybe your mood is getting a little bit worse, or your sleep's getting a little bit all of those little things that I talked about before, if you start to notice a few of those things, that is generally a really good indicator that it's time to take a bit of a break. And we don't have to wait for those things to occur. I'd much rather actually take the break before those things pop up, because then we're almost chasing our tail a little bit. But if we get on top of it earlier, then again, we're going to be much more successful. And again, that's why I sort of put that 8 to 12 week bracket in place, because it's less likely to happen in that time frame. Now, the other consideration is how long you should take a diet break for, or take a break from being in a deficit for. Now, ideally, the minimum is half the time that you've spent in a deficit, if not longer. So if I was in a fat loss phase for 12 weeks, I would then take a break for a minimum of 6 weeks at maintenance, okay? And at maintenance, or, even being in a surplus, that's for a future episode, okay? But like I said, 6 weeks at minimum. And the reason for this, which I'm going to be discussing in a future episode, but a lot of this has to do with that metabolic adaptation. And what the research shows us is that if we spend at least half the amount of time of what we're in a deficit for being out of a deficit, then there is a likelihood that metabolic adaptation will start to go back the other way, which means we can start to, consume a little bit more food again, start to burn a little bit more energy without having that increase in weight gain. But like I said, that is a conversation for a future episode. And the other thing that I do want to talk about, but again, I'm going to talk about more in a future episode, is taking diet breaks and refeeds during your fat loss phase as well, which is another strategy that you can implement to help your overall fat loss phase be more successful. And again, this is something, if you were to implement these things, it might make you change the timeline and the length of your deficit. But I'm going to be also talking about diet breaks and refeeds in a lot more detail in a future episode. But that is it for today's episode. Hopefully not too overwhelming, and hopefully you actually understood that. But if you do have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me. As always, if you have a question for the show, you can send an email to contact@thefatlossacademy.com.au. But again, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to share this episode with someone if you think they'll find it useful and they might enjoy it. And if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to like the video and hit subscribe. Or if you're listening on a podcast app, hit subscribe and leave a 5-star rating if possible. It really helps. And I'll catch you all in the next episode.